Okay, hey everyone. I am doing a lecture right now for circuit debaters and the transition to APDA for people who are coming from circuit debate types. So this is mostly aimed at people who are coming from things like PF, LD, and policy, which are the typical circuit debate formats in the US. And the goal of this lecture is just to teach you about the norm differences, what to expect when you're coming into APDA, and how to best prepare for it. So let's get right in. The basic structure is the first thing I'm going to cover. Hopefully, you all have a general sense of this before going into your first APTA tournament, but I'll cover it like briefly here just to make sure. So there are 6 speeches in total, 3 for each side. It starts with the Prime Minister's constructive. We are a parliamentary event, technically, so we use all the parley terms. So the first speaker on the Gov is called the Prime Minister or the PM, and they have a 7.5 minute speech. Technically, this is like a 7 minute speech with a 30-second grace period, but as the event has evolved and become more competitive, I would say people just use the grace period every time. So it functionally just becomes a 7:30 minute, a 7 minute and 30 second speech every time in every round. And no one usually just goes for 7 minutes, since you want to pack as much information into the speech as possible. And that is a constructive speech, which means you're just giving, all of your arguments as any constructive would be. It's followed by the constructive speech on the other side, which is from the leader of opposition, which is what we call the first speaker on the op. And they get 1 extra minute, so they have 8.5 minutes. Their role in this speech is unlike in like PF, for instance, you're not just providing your own constructive, you're also adding arguments against the prime minister's constructive that you just heard. So you should be both providing what we call an off case, which is like the neg arguments, the op arguments, as well as refuting some of the on case, which is the PMC that you just heard in the former speech. It's followed then by the member speeches. So this is the second speaker on each team. They only get 1 speech, but it's a pretty important and powerful speech. So the member of government is the only chance the Gov team has to respond to the LOC, which is the leader of opposition's constructive that just happened. And they basically just have to line by line the shit out of the entire LOC. And they can also add new arguments. So they can do things like add an MG spike, which is just a new offensive argument on the Gov that comes out in MG. The member of opposition, which is the MO, follows that, is also 8.5 minutes. You'll notice a trend in all of these speeches. And they have a similar role, although they sort of have, I would say, the highest ceiling and the lowest floor out of any of these speeches. They don't have to necessarily do all that much, except for just answer the new MG arguments, because it's the only chance that you have to answer the MG. But they have opportunities to do a whole lot more. They can add their own arguments. We usually call this an MO dump when they just add a bunch of new arguments. So they could just like give an entirely new LOC in the MO, or they could give new answers to the PMC. So the MO is an interesting speech because unlike in other circuit formats, where like the fourth speech down usually doesn't have all that much freedom of movement or flexibility. The MO in APTA actually has like literally infinite freedom. You can say whatever you want. It doesn't matter if it's new. There's no newness norms in terms of what the MO can or cannot do. That's not true, though, for the last 2 speeches in the round. Intuitively, this is the same as other circuit formats. So the leader of opposition rebuttal is a lot shorter. So the round shortens down. People collapse on different arguments. They have 4.5 minutes to condense the entire round that just happened into a reason to vote for them. You'll notice, interestingly, that this goes right after the member of opposition. So it goes op instead of op-gov. This is the op block, is what we call it. It's similar to the neg block in policy. And their job is basically to take everything that their member just said, everything that was in the LOC, and was well defended, and make it into ballots. So construct all of the weighing, for instance, and preempt what they think the next speech, which is the PMR, is going to say, to close out the entire round. So that means just going for certain collapses, and also preempting the collapses that you expect the Gov to go for. And then the last speech in the round, which is 5.5 minutes, is the PMR. Again, no new things at all. You just got to go for whatever you can. You can obviously respond to things from the MO and LOR because this is the only opportunity that you have to respond to those speeches, which is the risk of maybe doing an MO dump is the PMR gets brand new responses and you can't contest them. However, in both the LOR and PMR, there's no new content other than that is allowed. And in fact, there's an interesting mechanism that is built into APTA that doesn't exist in other formats, as far as I'm aware, where you can basically just interrupt the speaker and say, point of order, this is new. And then the judge says, okay, I'll check my flow. And then if it is new, then the judge throws it out, or just doesn't consider it in their RFD. And if it's not, then they do whatever. But what happens is you interrupt their speech, they pause the timer, they say, no, it's not new, it was in the MO actually, or something like that. You say, no, actually it wasn't, and then the judge says, just sit down, both of you, I'll figure it out. And then the time continues and they pick up where they left off. So there is a bit of stoppage time that's built into sort of LOR and PMR for that reason. Um, but it's sort of weird at first, but you get used to it, I think, very rapidly. What that does mean, though, is that typically judges do consider new material that they think is new if it was not called as a point of order. Unlike other formats, it's not really on the judge to determine what's new. It's sort of on you to determine what's new, or at least flag something for the judge to consider if it's new. Okay, so this is just like a condensed version of that basic structure with the times. The one thing that wasn't in that last slide is that there's a period of time before the round begins called POC time or point of clarification time. This is 15 minutes. It's functionally just 15 minutes of prep. This happens after you get the topic, but before you start the round. So you basically get, topic is given to you. All of the background information that might be necessitated in order to debate the topic is given to you as well. In motions, which is what we'll be debating in this tournament, this is called an info slide. Motions is just debate where the tournament itself hands out the topic in every round, just like they do in high school debate events, like the NSDA hands down resolutions. Well, our tournament will be handing down topics for each and every round, and you'll get those topics 15 minutes before you're supposed to start the PMC. However, most of APDA is actually something called case debate, where the Gov gets to choose what the topic is every round. And so what happens is they'll tell you all of the relevant background information you might need to debate the topic. Then they'll tell you the exact wording of the topic. And then starting after that, you have 15 minutes for the op to ask them clarifying questions or points of clarification, and for them to prep whatever the LOC or whatever they might be prepping. It used to be that like this was strictly just for clarifying questions, but as the event has evolved, people have realized like they don't want to waste people's time by just asking a bunch of filler questions in order to run out the clock. So usually Gov teams will just allow you to take the 15 minutes of prep. And in fact, the judge will usually necessitate that the Gov team allows you to do that. But in this tournament, you don't have to worry about that because it's motions. So the CA team who is running the tournament has tried to set you topics that we think are balanced on both sides. And then, yeah, it goes PMC, LOC, MG, MO, LOR, PMR. Okay, so now I have like 3 slides that are just a summary of the structural differences between APDA and each of the 3 debate events that this is geared towards. So I'll start with PF. PF is what I did for 4 years in high school. So here are all of the like bullet points of differences. I'm just going to go through this really fast, although you can read. If you want to skip this part, maybe it's boring. There's no coin flip, so unlike in PF where you flip a coin to decide if you're first or second, and if you're AF or neg, you just get assigned Gov or Op. The tournament has a sort of a formula to do this so that you get Gov or Op relatively in similar proportions. You have 5 in rounds or 5 prelims in a typical APTA tournament, so you'll either go Gov 3 times or Op 3 times. And then this is also used to decide if you'll be Gov or Op in out rounds. The only time when there's a coin flip is when both teams that are like set to debate, like quarters, for instance, had the same amount of Govs in prelims. So let's say they both had 3 Govs, then there's a coin flip to decide who's Gov. But if one team had 3 Govs and the other team had 2 in prelims, then the team that had 2 has the opportunity to choose Gov if they want. They can also defer this choice and just allow the other team to choose, in which case they get to sort of keep the low Govs for later rounds if they win. So that there's sometimes a strategy in case APTA where you'll want to defer choice to the other team if you are really confident that you'll beat them even when you're on op, so that you can be Gov in later out rounds if you do win. Evidently we call AF Gov and Neg Op, again, they're parley terms. Gov always speaks first, unlike in PF, and they get 3 speeches instead of 4. There's no crossfires, as you might have noticed. Instead, we replace that with POC time, which is the 15 minutes of time to ask clarifying questions and do prep before. Notably, there's not really POCs and motions debate because there's no one to ask clarifying questions to, although you can ask motion clarifications in extreme circumstances where you like really do believe that something about the wording of the topic needs to be clarified, and then you'll ask it in a public like Discord channel typically, and it'll be clarified publicly for everyone who's competing at the tournament. I also included something called POIs here. So this is sort of fading out of fashion in APTA. A lot of people don't accept them or don't like take them in speeches, but POIs are something that you might have heard of in the context of BP or World Schools debate. They're called points of information or points of inquiry. And you can stand up and like raise your hand or ask POI during someone else's speech, and they can choose to either say, yes, I'll take your question, or I'll take your point. or no, like sit down. Usually they'll wave you down. That's what oftentimes happens in APDA. The reason for this is that they're still on time, so you don't like pause your timer like you do for points of order for POIs. Instead, you just continue right along with your speech time, and then you just like answer the question and move on. They can be fun. They can like be good for engagement, and a lot of people like them a lot, but they're not often done in APDA, so maybe not something to expect. Also, of course, the main difference between PF and APTA is that there's an op block. So Gov speaks both first and last because there's two back-to-back op speeches, which is interesting. They're also longer, much longer than PF speeches, like over double the time. And you get a different topic every round. There aren't any cards. There's no research to be done in APTA really, unless you're like researching stuff about a case to run. Especially in motions tournaments, like maybe you'll do some research about like worldly things. Like people do an extemp, like I don't know, have some people have a file of all of the information about like the world news that they've read in the past few months. Because it can sometimes be helpful just to know more about the world that you can then cite in a round. But really, there's no cards that are involved because no one is expected to have written any prep on the topic beforehand, and you only get 15 minutes without internet or without Googling. It's like honor system before the round starts after you're given the topic. So really, there's only analytics and what you have, the information that you have from the background or info slide that you have to work with. The second op speech, so the MO, also can give new answers to the first gov speech. So again, I told you that they have like kind of infinite freedom and infinite flexibility. That also means that if the LOC, so that first op speech, doesn't address one of the points in the PMC, the first gov speech, they still have another chance to in the MO, but no chances after that. There's also no extension requirement. This one I'll talk about more later, but it's a really interesting one. So in PF, people can be really nitpicky about like the quality of your extension. Like if you don't extend every single warrant in your link chain or whatever, some judges will just like cross it off their flow. I remember like thinking this was sort of strange back in like the early days of PF when I was like a sophomore and a judge like voted against us in like the September topic because we didn't extend an impact in the summary. And I was like, what the heck? That doesn't make any sense. Just because it's not extended doesn't mean that it just goes away. But of course, it does in PF. So that's not a thing in APTA. Judges aren't picky about the quality of your extensions. You don't have to do any extensions at all in the member speeches. And the LOR, PMR, the only like extensions that are necessary are just sort of like directing your judge's attention back to the arguments that you are going for that you're collapsing on. So it's not really an extension at all. It's just like we're winning on this argument and here's the weighing and here's what they said and here's what we said. But you don't need to go through and like you do in PF sometimes extend card by card. After all, there's no cards, but you don't need to do the equivalent of that either. So don't really need to worry about that at all. Again, I talked about points of order for the new arguments in the last two speeches. And one notable difference as well from PF is that there are some counter plans. This is pretty rare in APTA compared to like policy and LD, but you can do something called a counter case or a counter prop on motions, where if the other side is running like a policy style case or a policy style motion, something like this house as the US federal government would implement a UBI, then you could say, instead of implementing a UBI, we're going to do this other thing with, symmetric amount of fiat that competes with your plan, or, competes with your case statement as it is in APTA. This is pretty rare. You do have to stick to it. So there's not like conditional counterplans as there are in some cases in policy and LD. But I have run them at times before. I've seen other people run them pretty successfully. So for that reason, a lot of cases, like insert in the words like, we think it is preferable to the status quo to do this thing, so that you can't just argue for like this other nonsense thing instead. There's also no prep time, so that's a big thing to get used to. There's every speech just is back to back to back. No crossfire, no prep time means that it's kind of a double whammy for people transitioning from PF. As soon as the PM sits down after the PMC, the LO has to immediately stand up. Okay. For LDers, it's a lot of the same. So again, like the wording, the terms that we use for gov and op, you have partners now, so that's pretty cool. Again, both sides get 3 speeches instead of the neg just having 2. So the 2N and LD is split into the MO and LOR is one way of thinking about it. Again, different topic every round. In this case, we'll be doing motions. There's no cards. The reason I put spec in here is because we call that like specific information or spec information in APTA. So sometimes people will say, Especially in case debate, actually pretty much exclusively in case debate. If you're Gov and you say like, if your topic is about like the U.S. military base in Okinawa, and the op just doesn't really know very much about it, and you didn't put anything in background, and your entire case is about the nuances of Japanese history with regard to Okinawa, and that's what all of your arguments are about, then the op would probably stand up and say, this is like specific information. There's no way we could have known any of this. This makes the debate like way unfair for us, a little bit of theory. So the judge should throw it out. This typically doesn't happen in motions, but still most of your arguments should be based on like analytics and warrants, and using actual factual information as sort of evidence for that, or as examples of that, rather than as the crux of the argument itself. There's also no cross-X. Just like in PF, there's no crossfire. Instead, again, there are POCs and POIs. The 2in gets new answers to the 1AC functionally, or the equivalents, just like I said in the PF slide. No extension requirement, points of order, slightly longer speeches, and also balanced total speech time. So one complaint that some people have about LD is that the speech times are a bit unbalanced. But that if you add together all of the speech times in APDA, they come out to the same thing. There's also no docs at all. I guess the exception is like PMC sometimes, right? In case debate, you can prep your entire PMC ahead of time, and you can prep some of your MG ahead of time as well if you're anticipating certain responses from the LOC. But most of this is not read off of a doc. And even when it is, it's usually not spread. There are exceptions for sure. Like there are some speeches that I've seen in APTA that were like very, very, very fast, and probably I would consider spreading. But nothing close to the maximum speed that people go in circuit LD or circuit policy. So expect slightly less speed. And this kind of makes sense, right? Because like the reading part of spreading is referring to reading off of like prepped material. And if you have less prepped material, especially in the context of like motions debate, where you only have 15 minutes total, it's going to be harder to generate enough material that you can actually like spread it off of your computer. Some people like spread off of their flows without really reading, so I guess it's not really spreading, and get pretty fast as well, but it's nothing compared to what you might have experienced in LD and policy. There's also less theory in K debate. It's kind of makes sense why, right? Like especially in case debate, if you can choose the topic, it seems like a lot of the reasons to run a KF, for instance, are lessened, and there's less reason to do something like theory because there's a lot less going on that you could like possibly use to cheat in any way. But it still exists to some extent. I'll also get to that on future slides. And again, there's no prep time. Same thing for policy. AF is gov, neg is op. There's a different topic every round. So one way that you can think about this in the context of policy and maybe LD as well is that cases in case debate in APTA are kind of like plans, except you don't have any resolution. There's like no topical basis for your plan at all. So imagine that you could run a plan on any topic, but no one would ever run topicality on you, and they would just have to debate it out and go with it. That's kind of what APTA is like. There's 3 speeches instead of 4. There's no cards, no docs, no cross-X. There's points of order for newness in the last 2 speeches, no extension requirement, less theory in K debate, and no prep time. Okay, now that I've moved on from the boring slides, let's talk about a few specifics. So the first one is judging norms. This is one that you might be wondering about a lot. It's like, what are the judges like? Well, they're all other competitors typically, or former competitors usually. So APTA is unique in that it's a fully student-run activity, meaning that all of the judges are also just fellow college students who have done debate, usually in high school, oftentimes, like always in college as well, who've done APTA themselves. This makes it a lot more tech, I would say, than the average circuit PF round. In fact, I would say that both the ceiling and the average are higher in terms of like total technical capacity to keep up with what you're saying and fully evaluate the round from like a tabula rasa perspective. There's a pretty heated debate both in PF and in APTA about whether or not judges should be tabula rasa, or if that's even a thing that exists. I would say that it's slightly less tabula rasa and slightly less tech maybe as a result than circuit LD and policy. Although it has less judge dogmatism than circuit LD and policy as well. So in circuit LD and policy, maybe you'll have judges who will vote against you purely based on you making an argument that they don't like, or like a stylistic thing. You have K hacks and theory hacks or whatever. At least there are rumors of these things existing. Not really much of a thing in APTA. Most APTA judges are very similar, and most of them evaluate basically everything. I will say, however, that judge experience does fluctuate a bit within brackets. So one weird thing that APTA does is that when we're pairing rounds, like the 3-0 hits the 3-0 or whatever, we will allocate the most experienced judges to the highest brackets and the least experienced judges to the lowest brackets. There's a lot of like controversy around this, but it's just something to note, something that you should expect when you're going in, is that you might have less experienced judges if you're doing worse in terms of your record in the tournament. Um, Panels also do consensus voting when possible. So your panels will confer with one another, which is like a totally weird thing when you're coming from PF, LD, and policy that you need to get used to. I think it's pretty cool. Like it definitely makes for different decisions, I would say. And what will happen is they'll talk with each other about who they think won for 15 minutes, and then if they can't come to an agreement, they'll just vote on like a 2-1 split, for instance. And there's only panels in out rounds, but sometimes in prelims, you'll have enough judges that they'll pair a very experienced judge with what they call a wing, which is like a novice judge who isn't actually going to be involved in the voting process at all, but will help the judge who is involved in the voting process talk through their decision and sort of watch how their thought process works. Theory stuff. So this is an interesting conversation to have. Oftentimes with circuit debaters, there's just not all that much theory in APDA, but the theory that is there is very sort of codified. So there's 3 concepts to know about in particular, and all of them relate to case debate, and they aren't as much of an issue with motions. So for this upcoming tournament that we're advertising, the summer tournament that is motions, you won't really be expecting any theory, and in fact, you shouldn't be reading theory if you can avoid it. But there's 3 concepts for case debate that are important. One is spec. I already went over this a bit. It's just like a baby theory argument. It's usually like most of these are just drop the argument, not drop the debater, especially spec. But the soft spec shell is just like this argument that you brought up on your own case is like rooted in a bunch of facts that there should be no expectation that we could have known them before the round. So there's no way that we could know if they're true or false. There's no way for us to fact check them. There's no way for us to argue against them. You're just going to say, oh, our logical arguments are wrong because this is in fact a fact, which is totally unfair given that we couldn't have known that. And so you should drop the argument as a result. Sometimes there's like a harder version of the spec shell. I've heard it very rarely. That's just like this entire topic is way too specific for us to possibly engage. Like maybe there's a good op out there, but we couldn't know what that good op is because we have no experience in the topic. I would definitely not run this argument, like especially as a novice, because I think novices are oftentimes a little bit trigger happy with what they call spec. It's oftentimes better practice to just like try to debate it, even if you think you're going to lose because it's unfairly specific, because that's really good practice for what you'll get into later on when you, I guess, like move up the ranks as well. But sometimes people do run this where they, especially in the context of like really tough econ cases, I would say, where they just say like drop the debaters. There's no way for us to have debated this in the first place. Tight is slightly different. Tight is what you maybe are expecting, which is that like the first reaction that people have to case debate is they hear that the gov can set the topic and they're like, that's ridiculous. Isn't that like totally unfair? And the answer is probably yes. But there is a theoretical check where the op has the option in the LOC of either picking the normal route, which is the straight op, where they just say, no, we're going to defend the other side of the topic like normal, or they tight call. A tight call is where you say, we think this topic is ridiculously unfair, so unfair that there's no reasonable way that we could have possibly opt this and won. So we're going to have you try to disprove this and prove that there is a way we could have opt this and that there is a way we could have won on op. Because absent that, we think this is just unwinnable for op. And so what happens then is the entire round sort of flips after LOC. The MG has to get up and give a type block where they say, no, you just didn't think hard enough. Here are all of the ops you could have given, and they all would have been winning and weighable against the gov. And then the LOR, the MO and the LOR stand up and they're like, no. All of those ops are terrible. Here's what you would have said. They would have completely fallen apart and they couldn't have been weighed against the beautiful material from the PMC anyway. And the PMR says, actually, it's not tight. Oh, here's the one that you didn't really notice that's really strong, actually. And the round kind of goes like that. So the round flips and the gov becomes entirely trying to justify why the case is fair and why the op had a winning path. there's a lot of theory that goes into this as well about like what the bar is and how the judge should adjudicate it. But that's sort of the basics of a tight call. And the final one is one that's really fading out of existence right now, which is called a squo call. It used to be a really big like stock issue, kind of like inherency in policy, where the gov is not allowed to advocate for anything that already exists. Um, for instance, like it makes sense, right? You can't say like this house would create the United States of America or something along those lines. You can't advocate for something that already is in existence, that is already a part of the status quo. You can't say that the status quo is good and the op has to defend some non-status quo thing. Um, but I think that typically this is sort of just unfair for the same reasons that you would give for a tight call, right? Like either they're advocating for something that is a part of the status quo, and as a result, it is unfair for the op, in which case you just tight call, or it's like fine, right? Like you could imagine squo cases that seem totally fair and maybe even op strong, like this house opposes the implementation of like this house opposes world peace or something like is technically supporting the status quo but would be sort of a ridiculous debate for the gov to try to win. I think it would be the wrong move to like use theory on that and say like this is unfair because you're advocating for the status quo instead of just debating it. So usually people don't run squo calls anymore, but they used to be a big thing. Okay, K's not really a thing in APDA. That's kind of it. There are like a surprising amount of critical elements that are prevalent in a lot of arguments. So we have these two concepts in APDA called prag and principle. Prag is just like pragmatic consequentialist arguments. Principle is everything else. It's like all the other philosophy, like ontology and epistemology, like what we have obligations to do, what we have, what is constitutive of our identities, things like that, all these like high concepts. And those are kind of the two categories of arguments that we talk about in APDA. A lot of the principal arguments can sort of stray into the flavor of K's without really being a K. Like there's no like framework debate in APDA. We don't say like, oh, the role of the judge is to be like a critical educator. Nothing like that. But you can make arguments that appeal to sort of ethical reasoning along critical lines. And I've seen it been done very successfully in APDA. So that's all I'll say about that. But yeah, plenty of room for philosophy in APDA. Argument structure. This is sort of one of the things that carries over the most is advantage and disad structure from policy. Actually, all three events carries over quite nicely. So it makes sense for you to construct arguments with uniqueness link, internal link, and impact. Also, just like all of your arguments obviously should have claim, warrant, and impact. Warrants are really the most important thing, given that all of your arguments are analytics. They all need to have reasoning. They all need to have warrants. And you shouldn't be scared to make things up. I think a lot of people who are transitioning from like these very intensive research events where everything is based in facts that you know about the world and you can't say anything without a card, struggle a little bit at first to just like say things that they don't know are true. In APDA, one of the cool things is you could just like give 5 reasons why the world probably is a certain way. And then for the sake of the debate, it is. Like, here are 3 reasons why, I don't know, this country is probably an ally of this other country. You don't know if this is true, but if they can't disprove these 3 reasons, then for the sake of the debate, it's often true. Extensions. I said I would talk about this a bit more. Honestly, it doesn't matter too much. It's just like you don't really need to think about extensions, is all I'll say. I think that sort of the instincts that you have to extend things will be more than enough. You just need to remind the judge what your arguments that you're going for are and form ballots out of them in the LOR and PMR. Finally, here are some challenges that you might have with the transition, at least challenges that I had with the transition to APDA. The first one is having enough to say and time management. You'll have 15 minutes of prep total and then no more prep for the rest of the round. And it's a topic you might not be familiar with at all. You might be like uncomfortable with debating the topic, not because of like the topic area per se, but because you just don't have any thoughts about the topic at all. You can't think of arguments on either side. This was a big challenge for me. I think my advice for you is just try to add as many reasons for something as you can. Sometimes it's nice to start with a claim that you want to prove that would be good for you and then just spam as many warrants as you can come up with. Again, making things up is really nice about this, as long as you can find reasoning for why they probably are true. Dealing with new topic areas is a big shift as well. So unlike the debate events you might be familiar with, the topic areas in APDA are much more diverse and much broader. So you might have topic areas where, like in my first ever APDA tournament, for instance, in one of the elim rounds, I debated in the novice tournament, I debated a topic about breaking up with your boyfriend, for instance, which isn't certainly not something that I had like ever expected coming from PF. Like that's like the furthest thing you could get from a PF topic. We debate topics about like art and philosophy and like slice of life things, like how you should live your life. And these are things that you should grow comfortable with. But you'll find, I think, after debating them once, that a lot of the same like skills that you have in other policy topics, for instance, carry over quite nicely. There are also some slight stylistic shifts you'll pick up on as you watch enough and debate enough APTA rounds. Especially, I think this is true in the LOR and PMR, where there's a lot less line by line. Like the policy style, like 2NR, 2AR, doesn't work very well in APTA. Instead, you should learn how to form ballots more. It's almost like regressing a little bit in the perspective of some circuit PFers to like the three main points kind of summary or final focus actually works wonders in technical APTA. If you can group things really in like a really efficient and smart way and read like overviews and stuff, that often works really well. That's not to say that line by line isn't good. Like this is almost the exclusive purview of the MG, for instance, is just line by lining, and your judges will be able to follow no matter what style you have. But just note that technically there might be some benefits of learning the shift as well. What does carry over from LD, PF, and policy? First is you're already going to be ahead of like the rest of the crop based on your confidence and speaking abilities and like the ability to think about arguments and in like the offense defense paradigm and things like that is really, really helpful. That's like definitely going to carry over. After all, debate is debate. Also going for ludicrous arguments, like I think in my novice tournament, I won off of extinction framing 3 times. Like this is something that still works in APTA. There's like maybe a slightly higher bar for it. Not everyone is used to it, especially judges. But you can make up all sorts of crazy arguments in any kind of round, and you could try to win off of them. This, I think, is different based on the topic that you're debating. So if you're debating a slice of life topic about like breaking up with your boyfriend, probably not the time to read an extinction scenario. But you know what I mean. And the final thing is concession debate, which is something that is very prevalent in all of those events that I mentioned, is really, really effective in APTA as well. So if you know how to just like go for the offense that is undercovered and weigh the shit out of it and win that way, that works very well. So I encourage you to do that as well. Finally, here are some tournament details. There are 5 in-rounds or prelims, and then it usually goes to octos or quarters for any APTA tournament. I think ours will go to quarters. All of you will be starting as novices if this is your first APTA tournament, and you're in fact a novice for the entire first year of APTA that you have. So you'll be able to be eligible for both varsity out rounds if you go like 4-1 usually. But if you don't have a record that is sufficient to break you to varsity out rounds, you have kind of a second chance to go to novice out rounds, which is just usually the top 4 or so, sometimes top 8 novice teams that don't break in varsity. You're also eligible for both varsity and novice speaker awards. Novice speaker awards is just the top 10 novice speakers of the tournament. Motions are really cool. We're going to be setting some cool and fun and challenging motions for you. A lot of them have music to go along with them before we release the actual topic. So you might be able to sort of suss out what the topic area is from the music that's usually thematically related. And GA is where people usually hang out in between rounds. Ours will be digital, so we'll just have like a Discord room, and it stands for General Assembly. And it's a cool place where people can sort of get to know each other since the APTA circuit is a little bit smaller than like the policy or PF circuit. So yeah, that's APTA for circuit debaters. Thank you all for watching.